let me be the first to welcome you tonight to part one of the symposium, The Ecology of an Art Scene, entitled Community, un préambule. We are pleased to co-host this unprecedented event as part of the Paris-Toronto initiative, and I would like to thank our friends at the Canadian Art Foundation, particularly Christine Shaw, and I also thank a longtime supporter of the power plant, Anne Webb. My thanks are extended as well to Claire Lemagne and the Consulat Général of France in Toronto and the Institut français for the opportunity to explore the idea of artistic communities in relation to our most current exhibition, Mica Lexier 1 and 2 and More Than 2, which features the work of 101 artists living and working within Toronto's own art ecology. I invite you to continue the conversations initiated by tonight's symposium, and join us at the power plant for a reception immediately following this program. BMO is presenting sponsor of the power plant's current exhibition and tonight's program. So we thank BMO, again, thanks BMO, for their generosity towards our own arts community. I now would like to introduce Claire Lemagne, cultural attaché at the Consulat Général of France in Toronto. Thank you.
I'm really, really pleased to be here with you tonight and be able to say a few words of introduction for this event. The Consul General of France in Toronto is very pleased to partner with the Canadian Art Foundation to present the symposium, The Ecology of an Art Scene. And I want to thank you, the power plant, for hosting us for this part one, Un préambule. For those of you who haven't heard about Paris-Toronto, just a quick reminder, this series gathers events organized by Toronto institutions from March to December this year. The purpose is to highlight contemporary art from France and to foster connections between the two cities' art scenes. The consulate is coordinating the project, and the project is made possible with the support of the Institut français, the French government agency in charge of promoting contemporary French creation overseas. Thank you to the Institut français for this support. I'm really looking forward to the discussions tonight and tomorrow and hope that they may lead to further collaborations between Toronto and France. And I just want to end on a final note. As you know, such large events take a lot of time and energy to put together. So I want to take this opportunity to personally thank and acknowledge the amazing work done by Christine Shaw to put this together. And now here's to Christine.
Good evening, everybody. We're thrilled to be here with the French consulate, with the power plant, and with 21 spectacular people from both Paris and Toronto. I wanted to acknowledge very quickly some of the support that you've heard from, but we also directly received support from the Institut français in order to mount this symposium. The partnership with the French consulate has been absolutely extraordinary. We also want to thank BMO International Financial Group, without whom Canadian Art Foundation would not be presenting the symposium. They continuously support our International Speakers Series, which has allowed us to reach audiences across the country through different forms of discussion. So thank you, BMO. I want to take a moment to thank a very special and finely tuned ecology of its own, which is the Canadian Art Foundation and Canadian Art Magazine. We have an absolutely remarkable team, and it's because of that group of people working across editorial, communications, events, marketing, sponsorship that we're actually able to assemble such an amazing group of people and present the symposium. So yay, Canadian Art Foundation. We also want to thank Anne Webb, who is here tonight, who in conversation with Claire Lemagne at the French consulate and with Rick Rhodes and a number of other people from organizations across the city, played a key role in mobilizing the entire Paris-Toronto project and helping us initiate the symposium. So thank you, Anne. Yes, exactly. I wanted to just say a few words about the structure of the symposium because you're with us tonight and we're about to take some risks both tonight and tomorrow in terms of structure and format. So I thought I would tell you a bit about maybe why we're assembling 21 people on the stage instead of 1 or 3, which would be more typical. The symposium is, as you've read, aimed at exploring what makes for a vital art scene, both what creates it and sustains it. And one very important component of an art scene is community. So we wanted to begin the symposium with the concept of community as it is taken up in contemporary art practices, across institutions, and through different forms of critical discourse. We recognize that it is a highly contentious topic, and throughout our conversations with our participants, we've encouraged all kinds of responses to the concept of community, both affirmative, antagonistic, provocative, suggestive, so that we can really kind of dig our heels in and think about what this contemporary fascination with community is, what it does, and how we can understand it. We've assembled, as I've said, an extraordinary group of people from both Paris and Toronto, 21 participants working in all kinds of different ways to mobilize an art scene. We recognize that 29 people are not emblematic of the two art scenes of Paris and Toronto. They are representative of different ways of contributing to it. We recognize that you, in this room, are equally a part of that art scene. Hence the format for tonight's symposium. We decided, instead of having a plenary, which would mean one person speaking or a panel of three, was a bit counterintuitive to the idea of ecology. So instead we invited everybody to present on the concept of community. Importantly, this includes you and your contributions to the discussion. So our amazingly skilled facilitator, Misha Gouberman, is going to help us try and achieve tonight's event. We needed a skilled facilitator, so anybody who's ever been to the Trampoline Hall lectures, of which he co-founded, you know that if anybody's up to the challenge of moderating tonight, it's Misha Gouberman, so I want to turn it over to him. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you. Yeah, as Christine explained, there are a lot of good reasons that the evening is being organized the way it is, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good idea. We're going to find out. I don't know if you've ever been involved in organizing a panel, but it's not traditionally the idea to try to get as many people on stage as can physically fit. And so it's going to present some challenges. And also, when I talked to Christine, she was like, well, we also really want to hear, we want it to be participatory. We don't just want the people on stage talking, because that would only be the voices of 22 people. We also want to hear from the audience, too. So the thing about that, of course, is time. Which is that, if everyone talked for a mere 10 minutes, we'd be here for a day and a half, which we don't want. So we're going to try to run this thing on a possibly impractically tight schedule. And all of the people up on stage have very courageously agreed to try to come up with comments that they can express in 2 minutes or less on this fairly complicated question of art scene and community and the ecology of an art scene. But each of them has tried to come up with an idea, maybe not the whole picture, but an idea that they can express in 2 minutes or less. And we're going to go through them pretty quickly. We even have, I'll tell you now, we have someone off stage with a clock and a bell will ring. So you have more or less my guarantee that those talks will take 2 minutes. The way we're going to do it then is we're going to do them one table at a time. They'll come up and you'll have one table's worth of 2-minute talks. And it'll be so much, because you'll hear so many ideas in such a fast period of time. And then what we'll do is after each table, we'll open it up for questions. I will take a few questions from you. Now, the same issue with questions applies as with the statements. Because there's so much going on, we're going to try to keep this all very short, and our bell ringers, our backstage bell ringers, are going to be working hard. And we decided that a couple things about the questions. First of all, they should be questions. They actually be questions and not just thank you. I see some people, some statement haters applauding in the audience. You can't just raise the pitch at the end or ask a thinly veiled rhetorical question. They should actually be real questions. And also, one of the things about real questions typically is that they're not very long. So we're going to say about a half a minute for questions. And when you ask questions, I'm going to ask you, if you can, maybe if you care to, direct them to a specific person if you're so inclined. We'll see how that works. And then you guys are going to have, we're going to say 1 minute for answers and see if that works out or not. That may be impractical, but we'll try that out. That's the one thing I feel is subject to experiment. But let's see how we can do. So that's going to be the basic structure. There's going to be 5 tables, whirlwind talks. It's going to be so many ideas, and it's going to be the most ideas you've ever encountered in such a short period of time. I can say that with complete certainty for every single one of you. So that's what we're going to do. After it's all over, I think, as Christine told you, you're all invited to a reception at the power plant immediately afterwards. So there's plenty of time to talk more. And of course, tomorrow there's a day-long symposium. And all the speed of today, where we're sort of encountering these ideas in very quick ways, tomorrow there's an opportunity to explore them at a much more leisurely rate without all the bell ringing and nervous fast talking that I bring to the event. So I think that's everything that you need to know to get started. So what we'll do is, who's table number one? Are you guys table number one? Oh, one thing I will tell you is that also we are like, all of these people have very impressive biographies and histories. We will not be reading them to you because that in itself would take like 20 minutes of the evening, which is too long. So all their bios are in your programs, which you can read afterwards. If someone catches your eye, you can like read up on them. Well, for now, what we're going to do is can we get the slide up for the first table? And what they're going to do is that's who's at that first table. Those names are going to leap out one at a time, and that'll be the person. So the very first person to talk is going to be Gaetan Verna.
Thank you. So this is my comment. My interest in contemporary art is based on the necessity for a public gallery, such as the Power Plant, to be at the service of two distinct communities: visual artists and creators, one community, and the second one, a diversity of audiences. So for visual artists, creating milestones for their practice through exhibition and publications and our wide-ranging lecture series is a key element of the practice that I want to defend. For the audiences, outreach initiatives play a key role in the necessity that a public gallery gives to expanding its varied audience while being a cultural catalyst that engages all publics with ideas of today's creators. We promise, or I promise, with my team, an open forum and a variety of tools to experience and understand the works of the artists that we present. We cannot promise that all audiences will love the work that are presented.
So that was our first talk, and now we go on to the next. Is that the next person? And the next person is two people, but they still only get 2 minutes, and that's Suzanne Cart and Suying Lee.
Okay, what is community in relation to contemporary art? A, community is currently a material used by artists. Materials come in and out of fashion. B, for exhibition makers, galleries, institutions, curators, communities are our geographic area and those that reside within it, and the bodies that walk through the door that we tally, and the attendance figures that we keep. We and our funders scrutinize the numbers to try and figure out what they mean about our relevance. This statistical community tends to be apart from our insiders community of cultural producers. Given A and B, it seems that community is also something that we're moving towards, reaching for, whether it's as a material to make art with or moving into the community and out of the gallery space to seek wider audiences. Second question, is contemporary art's interest in community authentic or a passing fascination? This question seems to imply that there's one community or a common community. Community, including the art community, is made up of many groups. Whether our interest is authentic or passing depends on which community within our own contemporary art community you're asking. And it seems that then community is at once central and vague.
So when we work with a community, they're either an active participant or also the content provider. So what I'd like to ask is, can the community be formed by the exhibition or the project instead of it being a pre-existing blob that then we decide that we want to work with? Is it this common shared space? And instead, I think that we need to start thinking about the convergence of people in a place instead of a place in which people are.
And the next we hear from Guillaume Leblon.
Hi. I'd like to read the text. I'd like to read an interview given by André Zittel on communities in 2010. My grandparents were ranchers in a large agricultural valley just south of Joshua Tree National Park. I grew up spending a lot of time with them on their ranch and always knew I would come back to the desert. Given the nature of my practice, it was often difficult for me to make my work in New York. The world felt so insular. There, it seems like artists only hang out with other artists, and the larger art world is your only audience. Even though I started my career in New York, I always knew that eventually I would one day move to a place where I could make art that directly engaged the surrounding community. I didn't want to just make my work in the art bubble forever.
And next we have Christophe Migon.
a few years ago, I was in a similar gathering as the present one, and at one point the audience was asked what we had been struck by thus far. So a microphone started being passed around, inviting us to contribute. When the mic got to me, I said, what has most interested me is everything that has been said up till now, and everything that will be said once I pass the microphone. This kind of Cajun erasure or polite refusal a la Bartleby, in which one is removed from the equation by making a statement of effacement, could be submitted as an ingredient to an incipient theory of listening, and one that understands this act as a constitutive component of a community. But this is not just a disabling, disempowering mutism. It is offset by the simple act of sounding. Silence, listening, must be punctuated to be activated. And the properties of these markers are important, for the rhythm is where we encounter the pervasiveness, persistence, and proliferation of the performative. The rhythm is not always steady nor singular. It can develop an arrhythmia, a stutter. Given this unsteadiness, and apropos the diminutive time slot we have to contend with here, in the coming community, Agamben, quoting from Bloch, who transcribed it from Benjamin, who heard it from Scholem, speaks of the tiny displacement that is going to be the marker of the world to come in comparison to the present one. It's about the tiny displacement inscribed in the minuscule interstices between moments, between gestures, micro changes, microphonics. Everything as it is now, just a little different. In other words, the smallness of the gesture is not proportional to the scale of its potential.
It's okay. It's okay.
The smallness of the gesture is not proportional to the scale of its potential consequences. Or, as the Go-Go's said, see the people walking down the street, fall in line just watching all their feet. They don't know where they want to go, but they're walking in time. We got the beat. Yeah, we got the beat.
So that's how it goes. That's what it's like, hearing all those ideas in that much time. Now the next question in our experiment with this format is whether you guys have any questions. Are there any questions? Is there anything anyone would like to know?
Is it possible to have more direct access by artists in the community that don't have any exposure?
Like, for instance, down at Harbourfront, if you had one wall where, local artists that don't have exposure could display their work for, say, a week.
Well, just that you had already given an example of something that you would do. So it's self-organization and being able to do that.
So okay. Oh, so creating your. So you're saying that he should just go hang something on the walls at Harbourfront. All right. And luckily, no one from Harbourfront is here to take exception to that suggestion. So go ahead and do it. Anything else? Any other questions? Any other questions that people have? Yes, over there.
Just for perspective, I'm curious, maybe a raise of hands, who on the panels have lived in other countries for more than a couple of years?
How many of the panelists have lived in other countries for more than a couple of years? Now, of course, half the panelists are from another country. So do we count them, or do they have to live somewhere other than France?
Other than their home country?
Oh, so have you lived somewhere other than your own country for more than a couple of years, is the question. Have you lived? All right. So outer space, it depends where. If you're just floating above Canada, then no. But okay, so a lot of them.
Part two would be then, did you feel part of the community in your second or other countries?
Is there anyone who did that? Anyone who was in, would anyone on the first panel want to talk, in the first circle, talk about being in another country and whether they felt part of the community?
Yes. You seek a community, you engage in it, and then you can become part of it. So, yes.
What country were you in?
France for 8 years.
Okay. And you were able to do that there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have thoughts about that? It's not like I don't see a million hands up with questions, so we may as well see if someone else. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? On finding community in other countries?
Well, I think as we discussed tonight, the idea of community always changes. So depending on where you are and why you're there, or why you leave your own community to go somewhere else, I think it all depends on the context. So My own experience would be in some places, yes, absolutely. In other cases, maybe not. But it's all circumstance.
Do you have
right?
a specific place where it didn't work out? In your
I think it
experience?
didn't work out. I think it's like why you went to a place or why you might have been invited or why you went to do work in a certain location. Some of the places I've been and worked and lived, it was very much about being part of a community. In other places, it was very much set up as, you know, the desire to have me retain a kind of outsider perspective and be part of the dialogue.
So you go to another country because you want to be alone or because you want to be a part in the community.
Or it's all in the conversation, right?
All right, cool. Great. Anything else? Any other questions from what you've heard so far? Or just things that have popped into your head? Any other questions? Yes, you, sir. Yes.
My question has to do with materials and you sort of walking us through the decision-making process in terms of the materials that you choose to use. Oh, thank you. I think everyone heard me.
Do people hear it? Is it about materials? Question about materials?
Yeah, that's my first question. Second question, I'm wondering about the type of art that is coming out of the Catafil community, if there's any type of movement as far as that's concerned.
Does anyone want to talk about how they use, about the materials they use and how they choose them? Bonus points if you can tie it to community, but you don't have to.
Christoph, do you want to talk about sound?
Christoph, do you want to talk about sound? Yeah, you.
In relation to materials, sound. Well, it. You put me on the spot, Louis.
That's what happens when you're on a panel. You think you can, because there's 20 of you, you think you can hide, but you're all on a panel. You have to answer questions. There you go. Oh, he joined the community. Yes.
I mean, in terms of tying it to materials, I suppose people talk about the immateriality of sound, but a lot of discussion in sound studies these days talk about the materiality of sound. It just happens to be invisible. So it's about shifting the register. So
sound is a thing. You work with sound, and some think it's not a material, but you want to, but it is. In some ways. Okay, great.
Brief talk you mentioned about sort of an artist community, and then when referencing the non-artist community, you sort of positioned as statistical. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more now that we have maybe an extra minute.
Well, I think it's from my experience working in institutions, and I'll talk a bit more about it tomorrow and why Suzanne and I began doing independent projects. My first experience working in an institution and working with Suzanne was out of the need to do outreach and increase our audience. And that seemed to be about as deep as that goal went. So that felt like, you know, often in an institution, you know which colleagues are coming to your exhibitions. And when you do outreach, it's targeting a different community. Does that answer your question?
Okay, great. So let's move on. So that was table number one. We now heard from table number one. We've done now one round of this thing, which seems to work. Okay, yeah, woo, one person's very happy, and everyone else is still on the fence. But that's how it starts. Eventually, it's true, he is always happy, but that's why, the reason everything starts with his happiness and then just spreads from there. So we've had the first table. We're going to go to the second table. Now I'm going to warn you this time, remember, there will be time for questions afterwards. So if during the panel, maybe if you want to give yourself a little extra task, maybe see if there's something you're curious about that you might want to ask a question about afterwards. No pressure, but there you go. Who's table number two? You guys. Oh, great, and you have the microphone. How fortunate.
I just wish I could talk as quickly as Misha. I came to Toronto in 1995, and before then, and observing it since, it's an incredible city of artist collectives, of artist-run initiatives. And I've always wondered in that time, and kept coming back to, well, how can we make this somehow more visible? How can there be a greater synergy? And so when I was thinking about community in the last week or so, I started drawing little diagrams. You know those diagrams, the kind of pyramid one that's big at the bottom and small at the top, that's a hierarchical one, and then you have the horizontal one of lateral relations, the one that's like water, the waves on the surface pulled by deeper currents beneath. The cellular model that looks like a system of microorganisms, among them, of course, both weevils and parasites. The life cycle diagram, where the ecological, in an ecological sense, there's a sedimentation of communities that prepares the ground for regeneration. Whatever the model, for me, when an art community thrives, it has a sort of resonance beyond itself, in space and maybe in time also. And that's because of tangible energy that accumulates, is the important thing, through intersection and interaction of the micro-communities within it. So there's this drawing here that you absolutely cannot read, and it's a sacrilege to the artist Derek Sullivan to put it up. I thought it might read a little bit. And it just kind of came serendipitously into my gallery last week in preparing his show, and the more I looked at it, it then gave me another kind of provisional map to consider. And it's an imaginary one, originating in the artist's thinking about the art scene in New Zealand around 1983. He would have been about 7 years old then. So there's names of artists on there, some of them left, some of them are still here and influential. There's a couple of them crossed out because they didn't quite fit what he was thinking about. There are collectives, there is an artist-run center, there's a gallery, and then there are phrases like here and there, that movement in and out that can bring and transfer.
You can take a little more time.
And then there's that phrase, make your own life. And all of these are beneath a surface, completely covered with an active kind of gesture drawn with a gold pencil. The story is incomplete. The title of the work is Diagram Abandoned in Favor of Myth. So this is another kind of resonance that communities have.
So I brought a quote. This is not me talking, but Maki Suzuki from Abake, who was in Toronto in May for a 3-day seminar that happened at Art Metropole as a part of this same umbrella program, of which this, I believe, is a part of too. So the seminar was called There's More to Life Than Books, But Not Much More, and it was curated by Benjamin Tourelle, who is from Castillo, corrales, for which Guillaume is tonight, I think, representative. So, yeah, I asked Vincent to read the quote, but he said it's probably confusing for the public if he reads it instead of me, so I'm going to read it myself. So, they disagree on most things, in fact, everything, except on the fact that they are friends. So that was a quote he mentioned during the seminar, and he mentioned it actually in relation to a project called Invisible Dialogues, of which Abake was a part. Abake is a design collective, but working interdisciplinary, of, I think, 4 stable people. This is the book, so if you want to know more about Invisible Dialogues, the project, you should come to Art Metropole and look at this book. There's 2. It took place 1992, 2011, and it will take place in 2029. So the reason, this project, Invisible Dialogues, and the reason why I picked this quote, or besides the fact that it just came across working for the publication that this should actually also lead to, so there's going to be a publication evolving out of the seminar. But what I think it points out is the concept of difference, which is maybe inherent in the concept of community, and difference not necessarily as something which needs to be oppressed in favor of any community that needs to be leveled out, but as the actual point of departure for any productive dialogue. So difference not as something that needs to be eliminated, but as something that actually only enables dialogues. And in this way, maybe as a way to mark one's own otherness. A way to mark one's own otherness. Which is also not me talking. The way to mark one's own otherness is equally a quote from a description of a show that Castillo Corral set up recently. I'm actually not entirely sure if the author is Aguilla Insule or Benjamin Tourelle. It's either of both. Aguilla Insule is also part of a project that starts tomorrow at Art Metropole, in which this quote appears. So come check it out.
And who up next is Vincent Gonzalvez.
It's me. So I want to make a quote too. It's a quote from the Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito from his book Communitas, The Origin and Destiny of Community. Community isn't a property, nor is it a territory to be separated and defended against those who do not belong to it. Rather, it is a void, a depth, a gift to the other, that also remind us of our constitutive alterity with respect to ourselves.
Next up is Louise Hervé and Chloé Maillet.
Yes, and we will talk about a film and about several people. Victor Zebo on the right, a talented young cinematographer, about divers and most specifically a group of retired people diving in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes, you can see the woman with the pink pants. She's called Nadine, and this is there is her husband Michel and another Michel who are underwater archaeologists. But we also wanted to talk about Gilman and Jacques Tourneur, the famous filmmaker who was specialized in horror films and very much interested in Gilman at the end of his life.
And, about also a woman who disappears in southwest England. And yeah.
Yes, and Marianne, it was where Jacques Tourneur shot his film, but Marianne was the place where she found the first skeletons of an ichthyosaur, those gigantic reptiles from the Triassic.
Yes, and also about Dr. Marcel Baudouin. He was a museum director, an archaeologist, but also a specialist of the Atlantis. He believed the Atlantis was located between his towns on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean and the Americas, actually.
We also wanted to talk about another doctor in Canada. He's called Dr. Brett, and he's the one who founded hot springs in Banff, and maybe about his clients of the sanatorium also.
Yes, and about Pauline Johnson, probably, yeah.
Yes, and about Benoît de Maillet, so he's not a relative, we have the same name, but he was a man who in the 18th century wrote a book called Teliamed, and this is a book explaining that every living being on Earth is descending from a sea animal.
Yes. And maybe finally about the inhabitants, all of them, all the inhabitants of Savines, a small town in the Alps that was flooded and disappeared under a lake in 1961. And that's all.
Next is Andrew Hunter.
I do want to confirm that we are all descendants of sea animals. I can speak from experience. I look often to other species to try and understand the world. I think a lot about birds, which some people who know me won't be surprised to hear me say. The image you see on the screen is a massive murmuration of starlings. Starlings are one of the most successful invasive species in North America, introduced by a gentleman who wanted all songbirds from Shakespeare to breed in North America. Introduced 60 to Central Park, and within 20 years, there were 200 million birds all over North America. But I don't want to talk about the invasive species part. What interests me about starlings are these phenomenal murmurations that they form, which for a long time people have been fascinated by how these form and how they stick together. And for a long time, people had this idea that there had to be a leader, there had to be a lead bird, and all the other birds followed that bird. And more recently, people have come to realize that, in fact, that isn't how it works. That how these flocks form and stay together is that each bird is responding to the immediate birds around it. And that response to what is next to you, and that bird responding what's next to it, keeps these undulating forms moving. Fascinating physics and mathematics to understanding how these form and stay together. We've learned a lot from it. But one of the most interesting things about these birds and how they form is that we can sort of talk about the physics of how this all works and the patterns and they stay together, but we don't actually understand, because they're another species, about why. And that's what really intrigues me about these flocks. We don't actually know why they want to stick together. Thanks.
Fantastic. So that was table number 2. Table number 2. Are there any questions for table number 2?
I have a thank you to table 2 and then a question to table 1. I hope it's okay. I would like to thank you, table 2, for entirely ignoring the topic, because what it allowed, it actually allowed an inclusiveness approach to an art community. Because the thing that struck me on table number 1 was the strict division between art community and audience. And I would like to know, Why have you decided to define the art community this way?
So why did you define the art community in a way that excludes the audience? Is that the question? Okay, anyone want to take up that question/accusation?
If you listen to what I said that there were two communities that I was working with, and there was the community of artists and the community of diverse audiences.
Right,
They're
but so
not
you're
separate. We're in one world. So all these people cross the threshold of the gallery. So in the gallery you have the artist that's being exhibited, and then you have the people coming in. And the people coming to see the shows are artists, are people, general people that come into the gallery. So that is the community. But as an institution, I have a responsibility to the artists that I'm exhibiting, but also to the audience that's coming in. So they're not separate.
But you still think that there's a sense in thinking of them also as different, not as separated from each other, but think of them as different things.
No, as the role that one
Right, as
has
different
as an
roles.
institution to the artist that you're exhibiting. There's a responsibility to that artist, and then there's a responsibility to the people that will come to see his work. And within those people coming to see the work, we have everything. We have creators, we have human beings in general. So
Right.
they're not separated in my mind.
So people can be members of both of those groups too.
Well,
just
of course.
depending on- Okay, great. Does that answer your why? It may not satisfy you, but does it answer your why question? I'll say.
I was just curious about the way it got across, and of course I on purpose formulated it in this aggressive way to get a response, because it might have been just a misunderstanding what you had in mind, but I think that's how it got across, like this very inward perspective on our community, and I don't think that's yeah.
I talked about some separation, and I think it's an honest acknowledgement that community isn't one thing.
So community isn't one thing, and there's separation because of that. Because of that, there's separation. You mean? Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? So you say community isn't one thing.
It's not one group of people. I think it's implied that it's one harmonious group of people.
Right.
Okay. And I'm just acknowledging that it's not. And there's an audience that maybe feels somewhat apart from the insiders in the art community and the makers in the art community, the producers in the art community.
So people
and part of our audience is a group of people that maybe feels like sometimes they come to the gallery and they're curious, but they don't quite get it.
And so that is a different relationship. Okay, for sure. I see someone. Were you grabbing for the mic, or were you just saying like right on? Okay. All right. Okay. Great. Any other questions? Yes, you in the back. Yes, you, ma'am, who I've never met before. You had a question?
I'm just curious if Vincent, in response to this line of questioning, wants to talk about territory, and if Andrew wants to talk about singularity and multiplicity, or the idea of the one bird in the pack of the other, or the swarm of the other birds, in response to these really fascinating questions that are being asked.
So two questions. So a question for
I know,
Vincent.
I did it, Misha, 2 questions in one.
All right. Which one do you want to do first? So you want to hear from
Territory?
Vincent about territory?
Mm-hmm.
Vincent, could you have more to say about territory?
No, the thing I thought very interesting in the Roberto Esposito quote, it was that the community, for a lot of people, can be a territory, can be something very physical, like a land, like a country, like all the conflict we can see all around the world. It's about that. It's about the community as a landscape, as a country. But the community is more like that. It's like, as Roberto Esposito said, it's a void. And I think it's very important to have that in mind. And the thing that the community is a link between everyone, between all of us, and the most important is the question of the respect of each other. And even if we are very different, if there is 2 communities or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, at the end it doesn't exist. And it's very important, I think, to have always that in mind, that it's not just one thing, like a territory or like I don't know, like a group of people or like a center of interest. It's more than that. It doesn't exist because it's a link between all of us. And I think for the bird, it's the same.
And then your question for Andrew was.
I think I remember.
Do you remember it? But do I?
Oh, okay.
What was it? Well, why don't you repeat it?
Well, I was just going to go right to we were talking about the shift between the singular and the group and the collective. So again, back to that image I showed, I think we're always moving back and forth between being alone and part of a larger group. and we're always moving back and forth between this kind of isolation and interaction. And I think one of the really key things about dwelling on this sort of undulating mass that is the murmuration is that the birds are not aware of the patterns that they're forming. That's what's really fascinating. So they're moving together, they're aware of being part of a group and a cluster, but they have no idea what form they're projecting or what, right? And I think that's really intriguing.
When you say that, it really makes me think about like, oh, like that's exactly what we're trying to do. Like what we're doing is having a panel about community.
Yeah.
So do you think that would it be helpful for the birds to try to do that, or is it helpful for us to try and do that?
I think they're doing okay.
Yeah. So do you think it's helpful for us? Like, do you think it's a
I mean,
possible thing
back
for
to
us
me,
to
like,
think
I try
about?
to understand being in the world through all the other species that are in the world. Some more aware than others of how they're present. But I think, you know, one of the things I wanted to put forward with that was the idea that, like, one of the things we're doing now is we're trying to understand through language and exchanging ideas, like, what exactly is going on, how we're all interacting, and give some kind of theoretical notion, like explain it. We can do that with a murmuration of birds. We can use math to explain, but it doesn't really explain
why.
what's going on. And that's a lesson I think we should all draw from that.
Okay.
Right.
All right, cool, great. So that was table number two. And so this takes us now to table number 3. Where are you, table number 3? There you are, table number 3. And we're going to start with Abbas Akhavan.
First, I would like to thank the French-speaking panelists who are cooperating by speaking in English. Maybe next visit we'll do it all in French. Then I would like just to show this photograph of Frank Stella painting one of his black paintings or empty paintings or full paintings. And I was sitting as an audience member at a panel in Vancouver about 5 years ago, and Ian Wallace was talking about how Ian Wallace is a Canadian artist. I'm sure you've heard of his name. He was talking about how when he was younger, him and his contemporaries all wanted to paint like Frank Stella. This was a kind of an anecdote that he mentioned in his talk. And so they started painting like Frank Stella. And then years later, when he went to New York, he saw one of Frank Stella's works and was taken back by the discrepancy between his work and Frank Stella's work, because what Stella was actually doing was a kind of a freehand painting with a lot of mistakes, as you can see, a really messy painting. But because the Canadian artists were learning from books and photographs, Ian and his contemporaries used masking tape. So they were making much sharper but subsequently flatter paintings. I just wanted to show this as a kind of a relationship between periphery and center, sharpness and flatness. And that periphery can potentially be a kind of a self-imposed position of a faulty position versus an actual faulty position, and how Canadian artists negotiate that kind of distance between the hand, the subject, versus the mimetic object, and the center and the periphery. Thanks.
Hi. Given that tomorrow I will have only 6 minutes to talk, so I thought maybe today I could do a slight introduction to what I will say tomorrow. And tomorrow I will be talking about a magazine or a review we do with 5 friends, and which is, of course, a very bad idea, because there is this saying, you should never work with your friend because you might lose your friendship. So we don't work, which is much more useful, and this allows us to keep being friends. And we don't work, we just love long conversations in bars about a lot of things. And you know, this kind of conversation, the next morning you wake up and you have a slight hangover, but mainly on your phone or your notebooks, whatever you use, you have this long list of artists or movie maker or novels or whatever. And basically that's how we do this project. And maybe that's the kind of community of readers we want to produce. It's a community of readers that loves to drink a lot and speak for a very long time about diverse things. So this is it.
Next up is Vincent Honoré.
Hello. Following an article by Manuel Borja Vilel, who is the director of the Reina Sofia in Madrid, an article that was published in Art Forum, I would like to replace the word community by communality and think of the institution as a space for negotiations rather than representations. The common as a narrative, a collective narrative with no non-authoritarian and non-vertical methods of cultural action. The common as a shared being. And I will not lie, I'm French.
I'm Chris, and I'm going to be speaking with Maiko. We're here on behalf of Gendai as programmers of a year-long project called Model Minority. This project has included screenings of politically charged documentaries that have a particular significance to the marginal narrative of Asian American political activity. It also includes the design and facilitation of workshops to discuss the questions raised from the films, as well as experimental collaborative projects such as our neighborhood quote, rolling survey action carried out with the artist Alvis Choi of the Chinatown Community Think Tank and Maggie Flynn of Whippersnapper Gallery. It will also lead to 2 commissioned artworks by Will Kwan and Jacqueline Huang Nguyen, as well as a publication in 2014. Model Minority is on one hand a vehicle for re-examining the significance of a minority cultural institution like Gendai by cultivating a sustained conversation about cultural diversity in the art ecology. What can we learn about this by using the problematic figure of the model minority as a lens?
Quote, "This discourse representing Asians as a model minority originated in the United States and converges with Canadian multicultural and liberal democratic discourses to cast Asian Canadian youth as an exotic collectivism and uniformly successful group. The new right has increasingly championed the model minority discourse in support of neoliberal ideology," end quote. We ask, in what ways is the narrative of immigration, diaspora, and official state multiculturalism implicated? How does the model minority reify racial hierarchies? How might the cultivation of our culturally diverse communities be problematized in relation to the project of colonialism? Where does that put cultural activities of places like Gendai? One way we're approaching these questions is to look into instances where the model is subverted by a counter-model in history, pop culture, and everyday life. A guiding principle we take in exploring counter-models is one of rooting and shifting, inhabiting material, economic, and political identities and bodies without claiming some kind of fixed, essentialized position. Questions that sustain us include how not to reproduce the dominant culture yet again, which the counter-models are constructed against. How to do this and keep the questions rolling. Is this where the art comes in? As we move forward, it seems the aesthetic becomes combined in the curatorial, the organizing work, the formatting, the co-constituting of new formations, new bodies, through prefigurative articulations.
That's the end of table number 3. And so what we'll do now is once again see if anyone has any questions. Are there any questions? Yes, you in the back. Yes.
I wanted to just to contribute my comment about the birds and flocks and one and many concept. Like, there's not really a conflict in there because there's not community, it's communities. Because art is plural. There's folk art, popular art, commercial art, art for new expressions and ideas. There's art for therapeutical and healing art, and they are defined by the communities of people who are participating in different forms of art. Art is just too general of an umbrella, and under that there's a community perhaps of artists, but that's more in the philosophical aspect of it.
Was there a question in there, or was that just a comment?
No, I'm just contributing that there's a community, so it's in plural. We live in a world of dichotomies, dualities, so it's one and many, one individual artist in the audience, one in a group, and then there's a community of different activities, and then there's a communities as a result. So it's, as flocks of birds, people are organized into communities according to what they're engaged in.
Okay, thank you. If anyone has a specific response to that, you're welcome to. But if not, we'll see if there's I'll go to see if there's a question. Does anyone have a question? Right here. Oh, you do. Where are you? Oh, there you are. The question person. Yes.
So I was wondering if, because there's members of the Toronto art community and the Paris art community, sometimes it's easier to identify a community you're not in, like see the traits of it or name it or things like that. So
sure.
Can you comment on that? Like.
Do you want to know specifically what did the Parisians think of the Toronto art community and what did the Torontonians think of the Parisian art community? Is that what you want?
Yeah, because
should they leave the room when they do that, or
well, yeah,
like they have? Okay, does anyone have any notice? Like, have you guys been hanging out together? No. Okay, but based on just your impressions from what you've seen in the past hour, or even just a stereotype you have in your head, does anyone have any thoughts? Parisians, do you have any thoughts on what the Toronto art community might be like, or vice versa? Torontonians, do you have any thoughts, or anyone who's been to both? Yeah.
I don't have any opinion on the Parisian art community or anything, but I just know that there's a lot of discrepancies forming. This might not be an answer to your question, but I did a residency in Toulouse, and it was remarkable to see how fragmented and incommunicable the visual language in fact was, and the presumption of a universal language. So, being there and doing a residency and doing a show and coming to an utmost state of failure and understanding that like what I perceive as a visual language here, in fact, isn't necessarily applicable there. This might be a really simple resolution. I just arrived at it late.
Right, so
but that's one thing I would say is the fact that there's a lot of discrepancies even in the visual language.
So the visual languages aren't universal. They're okay. Was there someone else? Was someone else reaching for the microphone, or you were just putting it down? No one else wanted it. Did anyone else have any thoughts in terms of seeing the different communities? All right. Did you have another different question, or?
English. And I believe there's an expression in French. They say "Vive la différence."
Vive la différence.
Oui, n'est-ce pas?
They do. I think they do have. Can we confirm that that's an expression in French? I see. So okay. So that's just an addition to this. Okay. Great. Thank you. Yes. Did you have a question over there? Yes, you, ma'am.
My question would be for Abbas. I was interested in some of the terminology you used, and I guess I'm wondering how you would define the center today and where it would be related in relationship to, say, Canadian or Parisian artistic production.
Thanks. I think the center is a perception. I think right now the perception is obviously these kinds of grand centrals like, I would say London, Berlin, New York. Those things are shifting a lot, but I think the periphery is a perception towards the center that we keep, in some ways I keep seeing that that's really practiced here. So I think the center is shifting, but the perception of periphery seems to be stagnant or persistent.
So that idea stays even as the perception of where the center shifts. Is that right? But the idea stays stable?
It wasn't very clear. I was saying that even if the center keeps shifting, the perception of the periphery keeps staying persistent.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Yes. Sure. Yes. Oh! Run! It's nice if you do have a question to try to be as far away from the other question when you ask it, because it makes the people have to run a lot. Yes.
This might be a dumb question, but are there any examples of communities where there are no artists and an art community is created by the non-art group, sort of build it and they will come? Are there success stories about communities in which artists are attracted to a community and it sort of creates an art community?
Or do you mean where artists come to a place? Or
I live in a small village and we would love to have a whole load of artists and have an art community.
So you want to know how to have an art community in your small place?
Or no, I more want to know if there's examples of communities that have been, the art communities that have come about through the community first attracting the artists.
Through artists coming, but not through people just becoming artists themselves within the community, but from artists coming from away.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that ever happen? Hamilton, Ontario. Can you talk about Hamilton? Say what happened in Hamilton. Some people say yes, Hamilton, but some people don't know. Can you describe it?
Gentrification?
Well, maybe Andrew's in a better position to describe it than I am, but I don't know if there was a lot of artists in that community until recently, and for various reasons, artists like Starlings have flocked there recently.
It's interesting for me how, in Belleville, this concept of community